Okay. So yeah, Vladimir, you can see my name and email on the board. If you want to ask me any questions you want, you can email. And also, if you have any questions during the talk, again, you're free to raise your hand and ask. I did my PhD in computer science in England, or like more precisely in Scotland and the United Kingdom. But I'm very interested in Russian history in general, so I need to thank my boss, Mr. Lipkin, Dr. Lipkin, for giving me a chance to speak today. May I ask, who are you? I mean, who am I speaking before? I know you're from Jordan. What brings you here?
New student. This is my first lecture with you. My name is May.
Oh, I mean, like, are you attending this course because you're like obliged, or because you're interested, or because I don't know, for what reasons are you being here?
I came for this lecture because I'm forced to take it.
Okay. What about you guys? Where do you come from?
Ghana, somewhere. Madagascar.
Madagascar. Okay.
From Iran, Sina.
Excuse me?
My name is Sina
Sina.
from Iran.
Iran. Okay, right. That's a wide variety of backgrounds. Okay, so let me start about Russian history. Again, I know my handwriting is very bad, so if you just have a look at the board. So, speaking about Russian history is always a bit hard, because dissimilar to many other nations, well, it's kind of hard to define what is Russia and what is Russian, what is not Russian history. But I'll be, in general, more or less, so, I mean, Russia is very big, right? So, it's like so huge, and there are many citizens in this country, very many cultural backgrounds, very many borders with everyone. If we kind of try to speak about all of this, it would take infinite amount of time. But still, there is kind of official story, official kind of legend, which is predominantly established by the state authorities during various times. Because like all state authorities ever wanted to some kind of legitimize themselves and say, well, we're all here, and we is defined as this, and they gave you some sort of a book or a story or a legend which says who are we and where we come from. So what I'm telling you is roughly this official history of Russian state and Russian people, but just keep in mind that it's not such a simple matter, because the country is just too big to have a single historical line, to have a kind of a single official history. And there is like way much more than ever anyone is able to tell in just one lecture. And like generally today I'll be speaking about what is considered the source of Russian civilization, which is the ancient Rus, a period which starts approximately with the coming of the first Russian dynasty in these lands, the Rurikids dynasty, and ends approximately with a invasion from the east, with the Mongol invasion. This period constitutes roughly 300 years, and although there are like officially Russia claims to be a descendant of this state, of this kind of historical entity, we have to say that actually many more countries can track their own origins to this polity. So it's not interesting just because it is a part of a Russian lineage, but because it was just a very prominent historical entity in general. Apart from being a source of Russian civilization, or what we call Russian civilization nowadays, it is also a source of the modern Ukraine, to some extent modern Poland, to some extent modern Caucasian countries, and actually way more. why it is interesting? Well, although this country doesn't exist anymore, and the language they were speaking doesn't really exist anymore, still this kind of collective image of what is the ancient Slavic story. Yeah, I say Slavic. I know Russia is not entirely Slavic at the moment, so although Slavs are like the most dominant people of Russia, there are many other peoples as well. But still, the official historiography kind of traces its roots to the Slavic state of the Eastern Europe of the 9th till 12th century. And for modern people, it's not interesting just as a source of civilization. It is also interesting because the traces, the conjectures of this ancient entity can be seen in the modern life. So my name is Vladimir, and the name Vladimir is like 1,000 years old. And for example, it can also be traced in other countries and civilizations. So probably most of you read famous Swedish story about Carlson who lives on the roof. No? Okay, Astrid Lindgren. Have you ever heard about Astrid Lindgren? Okay, never mind. I mean, this is a prominent book for European heritage, and it's traditionally associated with Swedish/Norwegian, Scandinavian culture. But in fact, the name of the main hero, Svante, is a modified name, Svyatopolk, so which traces the roots again to the Russian heritage, to the ancient Rus heritage. Many artifacts of these ancient polity can be seen nowadays. So the architecture still remains. The St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev was built at that time. The Novgorod Cathedral was built at that time. The literature, the kind of roots of modern Russian literature, again, they were planted in the cultural landscape around that time. So the first works in what will afterwards be Russian language starts at that time. So my story will be roughly the following. In the first part of the lecture, I will briefly tell you about, basically show you some maps, how the landscape looked back then in the Eastern Europe in the 6th till 9th century. I know that's 300 years, that's a very long time. But in fact, unfortunately, we know very little about that time. So there are some Roman accounts of these lands, but mostly they say like some Slavic tribes lived in the Eastern Europe at that time. Sometimes they have names for those tribes, sometimes they're just Slavs, but essentially very little is known. Still kind of interesting to have a look how the national landscape looked back at the time. Afterwards, I'll briefly tell you about the kind of official story of the Russian state from the foundation, from the coming of the first Russian dynasty until this country kind of falls apart around 1199. And afterwards, after I tell you the official history, I'll kind of try to briefly show you where this culture can be met in the modern life, and how this kind of weird country looked like from the basically try to transfer the image of the how was the life in that time, and how the traces of this life can be seen nowadays. Okay, so this is Russian Empire at its greatest extent. You can see that the lightish green, can we turn off the light a little bit? So the dark green are the territories which were officially attributed to the Russian Empire, and the lightish green territories were like dependent on the Russian Empire. And this is very huge. Very many peoples lived in this territory at the various points of time. On the other hand, so from like a state point of view, it's very big. From the cultural point of view, it's also very big. So these are the kind of the hugest communities of Russian speaking, so we can generally associate Russian language with the Russian culture, and you can see that Russian language is widespread in the world. Many countries have huge Russian language, Russian-speaking communities, which not always associate themselves with the Russian state. So again, this is like a very big entity. On the other hand, again, if you look at the people who call themselves Russians, the native speakers of Russian, again, you can see that although the official territory is big, it's not like entirely 100% Russian in the official Russian borders. So again, it's a very vague territory. Okay, but still, generally we trace our roots to the Slavic tribes. This is approximately 500s, so the 6th century. Again, the accounts of the Roman chronicles say, okay, some sort of Slavic tribes kind of nomadically wandered in the Eastern Europe. And 100 years time passes. This again is 7th till 9th century. We can kind of see that Slavs more or less split up in 3 distinct subgroups: the Eastern Slavs, the Western Slavs, and the Southern Slavs. And eventually these kind of ethnic subgroups will give birth to Eastern Russian states like Russia, Belarus, Western Russia like Czech Republic, Poland, and the Yugoslavian kind of family of nations. You can see that, wow, there is kind of an enclave inside the Slavic tribes. And in fact, you can see this is really true. I mean, until nowadays, Hungarians and Romanians are not Slavic, and this kind of weird hole in the nation still exists today. But again, Russia mostly traces itself to the Eastern Slavs. So this is the approximate map of the Eastern Slavic tribes, approximately at the time when the Russian state starts to form itself. Not very much known, but we know that you can see the first kind of important thing. Basically, what is Russian territory lies between the 2 kind of important entities: the Viking kingdoms of the north and the civilized Roman Empire, Byzantium Empire in the south. Although it's a huge territory, these well-established polities, they needed to communicate. And this land between those territories inevitably served as a road between them. So when we start speaking about the ancient Slavs, ancient Rus, we start to speak about the so-called Varangians to Greeks trade route. This is like a very important notion. You can find it on Google. You can find many books dedicated to it. And this was the trade route which started somewhere in the northern Viking lands like Sweden, Denmark. And the final point was around Constantinople in the south. So the main way of transport at the time was not, of course, pedestrian, and especially not in the Eastern Europe where there are vast forests and you can't just go through them. The main transport way is rivers. So the trade routes essentially included, putting everything you have on a boat and starting a large trip all of the weird rivers which go from north to south, from south to north, transporting what was expensive goods at the time. So essentially, fragrancy, spices, and slaves. You can see this in many, again, it's kind of hard to generalize. Everything, when you speaking about history, you are inevitably telling lies. Because why? I mean, in physics, you can say, well, we have data and we have theories which explain this data. And the shorter the theory and the more data it explains, the better. In history, it doesn't work like this. There are not really theories in history. How come? I mean, yeah, there is historical data, archaeology, chronicles, literary accounts, phylogeny of languages. But you always have exceptions. And exceptions are not prohibited at all. And if your history kind of generally explains what is happening, nothing can stop an extraordinary event breaking your solid theory and tearing it apart. But in general, very many ancient states are formed like this. So you have established entities formed around, say, irrigation facilities like in Egypt, or like very old entities which exist by itself. And you have trade routes between them. And along these trade routes, inevitably, these trade routes lead to emergence of new states. Russia is an example of this trade route-based emergence of countries. What is also important on this map? In this map, in the previous maps, we didn't see any cities. However, in the in the 8th and 9th centuries, we start to see accounts of cities. Novgorod, Polotsk, Belozero are founded at that time. And cities are wonderful because when we're speaking about peoples in general, we can only rely on historical accounts, somebody remembering them and writing them down in the chronicle. But in the cities you can dig. And digging, you can see objective evidence of how people existed at that time. Also, you can see that right in the middle of the way between the north and the south, you see Kiev, modern capital of Ukraine. It's kind of logical that, in the middle of the long and tiring way, you found something which makes you able to relax on the long way. So cities were really important. So this huge territory which you needed to traverse with your trade routes or like bandit raids, you need to rest somewhere. So cities did play an important role in the ancient Rus. This is the end of the 19th century, or the 9th century, where we suppose that what is called the ancient Rus was founded. You can see that there are far more cities appearing on the map. Indeed, we have archaeological and literary accounts of these cities. And the official historiography, what I told you, starts about when these cities are genuinely united under a single rule. And wherever you read something about the ancient Russia, this is the Rurikid dynasty. Supposedly descendants of the Varangian king Rurik. Varangians is a Slavic name for Vikings, essentially. Various kind of pirates or bandit groups raiding the Eastern Europe eventually decided that, instead of raiding the country, we might as well profit from, making it ours. So this map essentially says us, okay, so the Russian state appeared at the time. And now we don't really speak about peoples anymore. No more these weird names of Dragovich, Spolans, and Krivich. Now we're speaking about Rus. Where does the name Rus come from? Rus essentially means an army. So again, the bandits come and make the land their own. They call themselves an army because to legitimize yourself, you have to say, well, I guard someone from someone. This is my land and I exert my power over it. So I'm an army. So the word Rus essentially traces itself to the Old Norse word which meant army. However, in many years this meaning kind of disappeared. So now Rus just meant, people of this land. So Rus, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Scandinavians, and the Slavs eventually melted in a single people. Indeed, when you see the names of the Rurikid dynasty in the 8th century and the 9th century, they have generally Scandinavian names. So yeah, we call people like this, like Igor, Oleg, and Svyatoslav, are kind of Slavic names. But in the 8th and 9th century, they all had double names. They had a Scandinavian name and they had a Russian name, Slavic name. This tendency kind of finds its way in the later years, but in the first 200 years, it was quite Scandinavian. So again, so this I was speaking about the trade routes from the Varangians to the Greeks. The purple lines on this map may show this kind of most prominent ways where the caravans traveled through Eastern Europe. Okay, so the kind of general historic account of what was before the Russian state is this. Weird Slavic tribes, not much account of anything. We don't know if the Slavs had any, say, literature in that time. The only few, there are very few remaining inscriptions since then, and most of them are in runic script, Scandinavian. So we know very little about the very little objective knowledge. We have accounts of the of the Holy Roman Empire saying, you know, these people send us embassies. We have Byzantium accounts saying, well, these barbarian tribes raided our garrisons. We don't have much account of the pre-Rurik Russia in general. Yet, on the other hand, after the Rurikid dynasty comes, very soon, in like less than 100 years, they decide to kind of record themselves. And the very prominent chronicle, which like every Russian knows, it's kind of studied at school, and you can find copies in the libraries, is the primary chronicle, the so-called Tale of the Bygone Years, which was written around 1100 by the order of one of the dukes of the Rurikid dynasty, which essentially starts the story of the Russian state. Again, very little it says about the Slavs before the Rurikids, but after the Rurik comes and establishes the Russian state, it's quite explanatory. Image you can see on the sheet of paper is a famous, again, so from now on I will be more or less giving you the account of the official historiography, which is basically constituted of a skeleton of the, you know, historical events we know about from archaeology or from other chronicles, and it's kind of decorated by the historical anecdotes, which we're not sure they're true, but Russians generally remember them and account them when you talk to them about the old age, and they would be happy to name certain events in the honor of this stories of these historical anecdotes. Also, you can see like how the culture, literary works, films, again, kind of process and recount this historical tales. So the first tale I'm going to speak about is the calling of the. So this is the ancient Rus at its largest extent. You can see that it's actually very huge, even in the ancient times the kind of official Russian territory was very big. So it's like greater than the Western Europe, like approximately the size of the Western Europe in total. And also you can see that it's kind of very fractured. So it's kind of a feudalist state with many independent duchies kind of competing between each other. You can see the neighboring nations interacting with the Rus state, moving around, having wars, having trade, having marriage exchange. And again, the official story always kind of stresses the how big and important in the ancient age was the Russian state. So this is generally the list of, again, we usually speak about the rulers when we speak about history. Why? Because, I mean, rulers recorded accounts of themselves. Every ruler wanted to legitimize itself in order to write some story about their history. We don't really read many accounts of the losses failures of those people. We don't really read many tales about the ordinary people. Again, because only important and rich people had power to record knowledge about themselves. And this is kind of official line, what was with the kind of official rulers, how the official dynasty perceived the rulers of that time. You see just 13 people, and every of them ruled for a very long time, actually, around 30 years. So that doesn't seem too complicated. Well, in fact, it was more like this. You see, the actual heritage tree is very complicated. Nobody can, in fact, there is no single heritage tree, either in the latest historical studies. So nobody ever managed to actually make a complete tree of all the dynasty of Rurikids, which governed Russia for 300 years. So the tree doesn't exist. It's still an ongoing research topic. But again, the official story tries to be kind of concise and simple and explain the ancient history as a continuous tradition. So the first anecdote I'm going to speak about is the calling of the Varangian kings. Again, the dynasty wanted to legitimize itself, and the story of the bygone years, the primary chronicle, begins with the story of how this dynasty came. And literally it says, well, the Novgorod people were unhappy about their own quarrels, and that's why they called for a Varangian kings to rule over them. Kind of tries to tell you, well, Russian people are not smart enough to govern themselves, but don't believe that. So this is a famous story, a painting of the 19th century, which kind of tries to illustrate how this happened. Again, very little is known, but we do know that at some point the duke called Rurik, we don't know his family name if he had one, came to Russia and conquered the three main cities of that time, Novgorod, Belozero, and Izborsk. Not that Belozero and Izborsk are very famous nowadays, but Novgorod, of course, is. And they basically, there were three brothers, they sat in these three cities and said, well, this is our land from now on. They were pagan, of course, some sort of Norse paganism. We have some sort of artifacts remaining from that time. For example, we see the famous Thor pendants digged in the Russian archaeology. So what they believed in was probably somehow connected to the Old Norse mythology, but we're not sure about that. So Rurikids grew out to be very extensive. So if you basically most nobles of modern Europe are in some sort related to Rurikids, either through the Norse route or through direct marriages to Rurikids. So these names, people know them. Even though it was kind of a long time ago, when you speak to people about ancient Rus, like half of these names people will recall. And the stories that are associated with them, they will know. I'll briefly go through these names and the associated stories. So the Rurik, the main thing is the man who came to Russia and established the Russian state. His heirs, weirdly, again, we know for some reason, when we speak about the medieval states, we usually speak about, feudalism and dukes and knights. And in France, say, French kings were Bourbons or Valois, but we also know lots of other historical families of France. We don't know such thing about Russia. Although we have this extensive heritage tree, all of them are Rurikids, and pretty much all dukes in Russia are Rurikids until the 13th century, when the Mongols invade and we see some princes of the Mongolian Chingizid heritage. We only know very few non-Rurikid dukes. I will talk about them a little bit later. And one of them actually is the heir to Rurik, who was his friend. His name was Oleg. You see, he ruled 879, 912. Why do we speak about him? Well, two stories are associated to him. Firstly, he was the first to bring Kiev into the Russian state, into the Rus state. And Novgorod is like a northland, cold, not very welcoming. But basically, even since the second ruler of Russia, Russia started to expand in the south, of course, most obvious route. So Oleg was the king, I mean, I say king, but in fact, contrary to Europe, Rus and Slavic rulers were not particularly fond of titles and names. So they could be called princes, kings, dukes, whoever. They didn't care really. Officially, like when Europeans wrote their accounts on Russians, they always struggle. And even though they was at some point officially king of Russia, but it wasn't king of the Russia we're thinking of. It was the king of the Western land, like Galicia and Volhynia Duchy. Anyway, they started to expand to the south. And with Oleg, we remember that he, not the Rurikid himself, actually followed the general Rurikid rule of exterminating all the other families, royal families in the east. So he captures Kiev and he murders Askol and Dir, that time the Slavic rulers of Kiev, and established himself in Kiev. And since then, Kiev is the main city. So the other kind of dukes may fight with each other, they may spread the duchies among themselves, but Kiev is always the center point. Who has Kiev rules the Russian state, at least officially. Kiev is the most important duchy of all the Eastern Russia. Curiously enough, another historical anecdote everyone is familiar with, brought to us by Pushkin, is that Oleg was although he's called Oleg the foreseer, Oleg the prophet, Oleg who knows the future, the actual story about his death tells us the ironical attitude of Russians to some sort of stories. So Oleg is dead because another prophet tells him, you will be dead because your horse kills you. And for that time, horse, was like there was a deep connection between a noble and his horse. The means of traveling fast, the expensive kind of source of valor, source of importance in that society is a horse. And Oleg says, well, I don't believe you. I know the future. My horse will never betray me. And he steps on the skull of his dead horse, and a snake comes out of the skull and bites him, and he dies. And again, the image of the king who can predict the future and be strong enough to predict the future of his country dies from not being able to do that. Next one. So Rurik has a son called Igor. Not much is known about Igor, although he ruled for like 30 years. But we do know that he was, again, aiming to strengthen and establish himself over the surrounding peoples. And the story associated with him is that him and his wife, actually the first woman on the Russian throne, the princess Olga, who was later named saint because she was the first kind of Slav we know, Slav noble who converted to Christianity, which is like another important pillar of the Russian culture, Christianity. But before that there were pagans. Igor comes to collect the taxes from Drevlian people, and they kill him for demanding too much taxation. And to kind of ease the situation, the ruler of the Drevlians, of this kind of oppressed people, comes to his wife Olga and says, so we're sorry, we killed your husband, but let us strengthen our nations, unite together and join our budgets, and basically let's get married, so our combined state will be stronger. And Olga denies him. She says, no, my state is independent state. Moreover, she demands more taxation, even more taxes from them. And they say, we have no taxes at all. And then she says, well, then basically I will collect your tax in pigeons, in everything you have, in like birds. And they say, birds worth nothing. Which says, nevertheless, give me the birds. And they give her the birds which lived on the roofs of the Drevlian people. And she digs them in oil and sets them on fire and sends them back. And they fly back to the Drevlian country and burn it to ashes. So you see that women in Russian history, you know, we don't see many accounts of women, but when we do see them, it's like this. These women are stronger than men. And she rules again, she rules for many years. 20 years, until her son Svyatoslav is in power, and she voluntarily gives him the power. We don't really know why. I mean, Rurik gave his power to his nearest friend, to Oleg. They were approximately the same age. How come the heritage line came back to Rurik's descendants, to Igor? How come Oleg died so conveniently for Rurik kids, even though he was a prophet? Nobody knows. So Svyatoslav, the grandson of Rurik, again, he continues the expansion to the north. And he essentially brings the Russian state to the nearly the extent we see, the biggest extent we see in the future. He fights with the Byzantiums. He goes in with wars to Europe. He fights with Pechenegs. He conquers Volga Bulgarians and other Slavic peoples living nearby. In the red line, inside the red line, you can see the Russian state, the Rus, before the Svyatoslav. In the orange line, you can see the Russian state in 30 years after Svyatoslav retires. Huge expansion. Svyatoslav is mainly remembered for this, for being indomitable, indefeatable war leader who basically came to what Russia is now, the main kind of part of Russia is known now. His son, the Vladimir the Saint, 1988. We know him because he was the ruler who baptized Russia, who adopted Christianity. Why this is important? Well, you know, Christianity is traditionally divided in the south, western and eastern, the Orthodox Christianity and the Catholic Christianity. And since Constantinople now is called Istanbul, it cannot be called the capital of the Orthodox faith, kind of Russia sees itself as the center of the Orthodox faith nowadays, although the Constantinople Christian region still exists. Again, at that time, there were not really two churches, so there was a Eastern ritual and the Western ritual, but the churches was still the same. The great schism has not yet happened. And also the kind of capital of Orthodoxy came to Russia way later, in the times of Ivan IV. But for Russians, Christianity is another main pillar of culture. Although nowadays you can see someone referring to the Asian paganism as a kind of traditional belief, there is not much account of that written down. Whereas Christianity was like a huge shift in the way of thinking. With Christianity came the. Oh, by the way, Vladimir was also he thought essentially that, you know, religious reform is needed. Initially, he tried to establish a pagan pantheon similar to the Roman pantheon before the Christianity. So, kind of official pagans versus unofficial pagans, and this idea failed him. So, he didn't manage to establish a single paganist belief. He started searching further. He said, okay, we need a monotheistic religion to rule the country more efficiently. The historical anecdote associated with this is that he called the representatives from all the religions he had available to him, Orthodox, like Eastern Christianity, from Byzantium, Western Christianity from the Holy Roman Empire, Judaism from Khazarian Khaganate. That's weird, because actually the Khazar Khaganate, you see, it's not really in the Holy Land, right? It's like way to the east. But in this interesting thing that they actually were Jewish at the time, Judaists, Hebrew, so they believed in Judaism. Although we don't really know if they were ethnically Jewish at all. But the history says that he did call them their representatives to speak about religion. Also, Islamic kind of clerics came to him as well. And again, Vladimir said, no, we need Christianity. Most obviously, the kind of official version says, well, because his grandmother Olga was Christian, the first Russian Christian like we know of. Also, there is a legend which says, well, Orthodoxy does not forbid drinking alcohol, whereas Islam forbids. And, you know, we like alcohol. I don't really believe the story, but you can, if you talk to people, they can really remember this event. They can bring this event in the conversation, so it's kind of important to remember that Vladimir maybe wanted Christianity because it doesn't forbid alcohol. So in fact, Vladimir III chose the Orthodox Christianity. Well, maybe because the ties with Byzantium Empire were the tightest at the time. The interesting is how he managed, well, when you choose a state religion, it's okay. You can, you know, proclaim everything, but also you need to somehow, you know, baptize all your people around. Like, you know, the Protestants, the emergence of Protestantism in the Western Europe lead to a huge war. In France, for example, at some point all the Protestants were like exterminated. So this was a big problem. Whereas this was not a problem for Vladimir, because he said, well, when you baptize people, you put them in the well, in the water. And he said, well, why don't we put a cleric in the water and say that all the water which flows on further is baptizing. So he kind of managed to baptize all the country in the same instant with the water of the river. Dnieper River. Again, Dnieper flows through Kiev. Again, famous 19th century picture says you how that's supposed to happen. Wasn't very, you know, it's kind of very authoritarian, don't you think? You don't just, you know, invite everyone. You don't just force everyone. You say, you are Christian now, because I say it, because the water which flows through your country kind of transports Christianity inside you. Okay. His son, Yaroslav the Wise. How many? 200 years since Rurik. Nearly 150 years. Why do we remember them? And he is like a very revered person. Russia has very nice accounts of them, and in the Ukraine there is also even a state decoration, the Order of the Yaroslav the Wise. How come two countries respect the single ruler that much? Why? On the picture you can see again 19th century painting which says the court of Yaroslav. He was the first guy who we know introduced the rule of law on the Russian land. Again, it wasn't entirely what we consider a rule of law nowadays. It's not like the independence of court, the independence of the competition of prosecution and defense, but he was the first to write the Truth of Yaroslav, the Russian justice, the document which codified what is just, what is not just. And this document remained, so you can find kind of reprints of this document in the library. And this document basically describes how these social interactions worked at the time, who were considered of more importance, who were considered of less importance. And in that document you see the division of people into three basically large classes: the nobles, the ordinary people, and the slaves. And in fact there weren't many slaves at the time. They were people got in the slave status usually because of being in debt or because they were captured abroad, but most of the population was more or less free people. Another thing, among the nobles, you can see distinct groups. You can see the Rurikids, the descendants of Rurik, this huge lineage tree, which are like the dukes of the land. And you see military. So military always has a higher status than the ordinary people. Not like hereditary nobility, but they still are kind of this separated from the rest. So they, later in many years, you see the social stratification between, various strata. And this is the place you see it emerging. Yeah, okay, right. And in the earliest times, you still saw Slavs and Rus, the army and the ordinary people. But it was kind of vague. But now in the documents, you can see the well-established boundaries between the society classes. It was him who initiated sorry for the stretching of the image. This is the St. Sophia Cathedral of Kiev. Again, you can visit Kiev. It's like a short weekend trip to see this with your own eyes. It was heavily rebuilt in the 17th century, but this is essentially the time, Christianing of Russia happens with Vladimir 988, and Yaroslav is like 30 years later, and this is the time when Russians start to build churches which are different from the Byzantium examples. So of course, what Vladimir did when he christened Russia, he started building churches. And they were absolutely identical to the Byzantium examples. 30, 40 years later, they say, okay, we're developed our country, our Christianity enough to start building different churches. You can see this example in Kiev. You can also go to Novgorod. The Saint Sophia of Novgorod still remains. You can have a look at it with your own eyes. I give you this picture once again. Why? Yaroslav, we know this is such a respected duke, and the ancient Russian state reaches the peak with his rule. So this is the biggest extent of his country, empire or state or country, hard to tell. Political entity. After Yaroslav, it only started to shrink. It fractures into various duchies which kind of conflict with each other. His children, not his children, his grandchildren, make four different, very prominent branches in the Varangian dynasty, and they're not particularly happy about each other. So they start to conflict, and this eventually leads the Russian state into decline. I mean, the ancient Russian state to decline, and especially when the Mongol hordes come. Might be that the united state of Yaroslav could have been a good opponent to the Mongolian horde. But the feudal fracturing did not allow that. So please have a look at the biggest extent of the Russian state. You can also see that the north is kind of loosely defined, again, because especially when you have feudalist or like medieval technologies, it's hard to build boundaries. Monomach, his grandson, the grandson of Yaroslav the Great. I told you that his grandchildren kind of made different branches of the Rurikids. And now we all kind of, again, if you speak to Russians, most of them will remember Monomach, his kind of most well-known grandson. Very few people will give you account of other grandsons, even though at that time they were roughly equivalent. Why Vladimir Monomach? Well, because his lineage gave birth to Moscow and to Moscow Duchy, and his descendants were in Moscow, and now Moscow is the capital of Russia, obviously. He was the person who we associate the ritual, the kind of, when you imagine the ancient Rus and the rituals you have in your mind, like, long dresses, the crowning hat, the scepter, and the, I don't remember the name of the other symbol of power. Again, you kind of associate them with Monomach first. So, purportedly, he brought the crowning regalia from Byzantium Empire to kind of establish themselves, to officially name them the regalia of the Russian Tsar. No, be called Tsars later, but basically Grand Dukes of Russia. His descendants kind of ruled Moscow later. They were competing with each other furiously. And interesting thing is, again, remember I told you that Rurikids were basically the only noble dynasty in Russia. All the dukes were Rurikids, except very few like Oleg and Raskold. How come? I mean, if your nobles create themselves domains where they rule, yeah, they can fight with each other, but it seems kind of cruel to, completely exterminate the other families. But there was a thing which kind of not really seen elsewhere in Europe, but was tightly associated with Russia, and it's actually seen in some Islamic states of the old. It's called agnatic seniority. When your king dies, you have to somehow establish who will rule later. And traditionally, you can imagine like two natural ways of doing that. Well, you can elect a new duke. And in fact, the Novgorod Republic, the way in the north, was actually a republican land, so they did elect their own duke. And in the Yaroslav's Justice, remember the first, the first law, codified law, they're listed separately from the rest. You can elect a duke. You can imagine, yes, like majorate, like in England, where the eldest son gets everything, everyone else gets nothing. You can say, okay, we can divide our domain in pieces and give a piece to each son, or maybe even a daughter. It was not like this in Russia. In Russia, the inheritance line was from an elder brother to a younger brother. So essentially everyone in the family were listed in seniority line. And wherever a duke died, all the dukes shifted 1 point up. So when, say, you have 7 brothers, uncles, nephews, when one dies, all of them switch locations all among Russia. When the Kievan duke dies, Novgorod one takes his place, someone goes to Novgorod, other one goes where this previous guy ruled. So in some sense, they hated each other furiously. I mean, wherever you die, your son is not guaranteed to get anything, right? But it had another point. It led to the fact that Rurikids as a family had no chance of ever leaving the throne, because they always had an heir to replace someone dying. Another weird consequence of this was that Rurikids were always married. So whenever you got into the age to get married, it made sense to breed as early as you can, because late children usually did not get anything, because your brothers breed earlier, and your land would go to your brother's son. Why we do know Vladimir Monomach? Why do we know him as well? Except establishing the royal ritual. This icon, I mean, Russia is famous for its icons. Say Western Christianity does not have icons. They have sculpture, but it's not really common to depict saints or God himself. And there was, in Byzantium Empire, there was even a huge debate if it's, what are the icons? Do we worship icons? Isn't it worshipping the idols? It was not solved. The question was solved for Russia easily. We don't worship icons. We worship the image of the saints or gods behind. But I mean, icon is a prominent symbol of Russian culture. You don't see many icons elsewhere, but you do see them in Russian culture. Supposedly, Monomach was the kind of establisher of the icon tradition in Russia. So he brought first few icons from Byzantium, and he made them popular. Obviously there were icons before, but it was kind of his intent to to get this tradition going further. So we don't have too much time left. So this is the heritage line of the Yuri Dolgoruki was a son of Vladimir Monomach. Why do we care about? You see, he's not listed in the list of 13 rulers of the Kievan Rus, because again, after Yaroslav the Wise, the state started to fall apart. We kind of respect Dolgoruki and his heirs because they were the line which eventually led to Russian dukes ruling over the state, eventually liberating Russia from the Mongol rule. So this is his heritage line. Dolgoruki, Vsevolod, Daniil, Andrei, and you can see Alexander Nevsky. It's like 300 years later, after 300 years after Rurik, 400 years later. I'll speak a bit about Alexander Nevsky later. But again, I have to say that they were not the only Rurikids line surviving. So for example, the western line of Rurikids, the grandchildren of Yaroslav and so on, had a whole kingdom in the west of Russia, which was called Russian land, which even had at some point had a king called the King of Russia. But this state is no more. It was absorbed by Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and the northeast Russia eventually. Speaking about the Moscow land, Moscow, you don't see Moscow on any map I give you. You can see Rostov, Murom, Novgorod, Kiev. It's basically a territory of modern Ukraine. You don't see Moscow. Why Moscow? Why you don't see any reasons why Moscow would lead the Russian land afterwards. The question at some point is, well, because Moscow is far. There is kind of nothing in Moscow, nothing worth raiding, nothing worth capturing. So when the Mongols came and when the Crusaders came, do you remember Crusaders? Those people who went to the Holy Land to liberate the God's church, the God's land. But in fact, they were not only the Crusades. The only Crusades. You can actually, in Russian history, in the Russian collective myth, we remember Crusades as the Teutons, Germans, coming to the west, to the east, to kind of bring Western Christianity to Slavs. Although the Slavs were already Christian at the point, Orthodox, and Moscow. Again, Moscow is not listed here, but Moscow is even more to the east of this land, and it was afterwards the source of assembling of Russian lands because it is far, because it is well kind of defended against the incoming assaults. In year 1147. In the chronicles, you see the account of founding of Moscow by the Vladimir Dynasty, the Monomach heirs of Yaroslav the Wise, by Yuri Dolgoruki. You can see him in the top of the slide. And again, mostly they were developing their own country, but the key to success of the dynasty, of their branch of the dynasty, was not to interfere too much, to have not as many wars, to basically build their own state. And what they're famous for, Alexander Nevsky, what he's famous for? He's famous for defending Russia against Crusaders on the Battle of the Ice. Again, in fact, when you read the chronicles and do the archaeology, the Battle on the Ice is not a very prominent event. It wasn't really that big. But people remember it. People remember it as an invasion of the Western Crusaders, Germans, in the Russian land. And Alexander Nevsky being the defender of Russian land against the Crusaders. The first kind of time when the Moscow Duke kind of announced his name as an important leader of the pretender on being the leader of the Russian duchies. The collective myth, the legend says that he forced the Germans, the Crusaders, to fight on the ice of a lake. And since Crusaders were armed very heavily, they drowned because the ice broke under them. This is not really true. But if you speak to people, they will remember. They will remember that. The image you see on the slide is a screenshot from the Sergei Eisenstein famous film epic called Alexander Nevsky, filmed in the beginning of the century, in the 30s. And this was kind of an important piece of the culture. Even people who didn't watch it kind of recall it as a kind of cultural pillar of the civilization. So yeah, I'm speaking about the Moscow defending Russian lands from the west, when in fact the main threat was coming from the east. The Russian lands managed to exist in a feudalist fracturing, kind of fighting with each other, not being particularly happy with each other, but they could have survived. They even could have managed to repel the Crusaders, but the Mongols were undefeatable. So the Mongols came from the east and basically led to the end of the ancient Rus state. They kind of flew from the country, ravaging and destroying it, and were only stopped around, well, basically Russian lands did slow them down, and they only stopped around the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. And the next period, under the Mongol rule, when you see dukes coming from Chingizids, from the descendants of the Chinggis Khan, is not called the ancient Rus. It's like a different story. It's a different culture, it's a different way of thinking. So with the Mongol invasion, the ancient Rus ended. Although most of dukes remained on their own seats, but they still had to, somehow have a look at their rulers in Mongolia. So this is a different story. Now let me speak. Does anyone has any questions about the official story?
What was the religion of Rurik?
Excuse me?
What was the religion of Rurik?
Rurik. Who knows? Supposedly some sort of northern Scandinavian paganism, but we don't really know. We know that Vladimir, like a few hundred years later, wanted to establish a state religion, and he studied traditional paganist beliefs. I expect it to be kind of a mixture of Slavic and Norse beliefs, but he didn't succeed in that project, so he had to adopt Christianity.
Why did Olga
choose Christianity? Good question. I'd expect to have a more kind of stable connection with Byzantium. I mean, on this map actually, you can see how Russian nobles interacted with the foreigners. I mean, we usually think of military like battles, like wars, as a way of international relations in the medieval age. But in fact, it was not. So people did trade and people did marry each other. And marrying someone kind of gives you a union, like an alliance. And perhaps at that time, I mean, Svyatoslav is recalled as having peace treaties with Polovtsi in the east 19 times. Probably Olga was interested in establishing more tighter connections with Byzantium Empire, because they were like a huge trade partner of the country. Does this answer your question?
And once more, the Byzantium was very rich among the others. Cities. The
richest, yes. Also, if you read more about the conversion to Christianity, so Byzantium Empire was, of course, interested in using Christianity as a means to control the Slavic tribes, the Slavic countries, but it wasn't particularly interested in, delegating the power to Slavs. So Vladimir, when he was baptizing Russia, actually invaded Byzantium and physically stole some of the clerics and like forced them to baptize all the country. So it wasn't very, it was very political. It wasn't really about the beliefs. It was always more about, soft power and control. On the map you can see marriages of Russian dukes to foreigners. In fact, in the pre-Mongolian Russia was very active as a European power. It had 13 noble marriages with the West, with Hungarian, Northern, even French kings, and in the East as well. But in the East it was kind of more weird, because Rurikids were kind of happy to marry the steppe nomadic tribes women, but were quite hesitant to give their own women to the nomads. Whereas this didn't work in Russia with Europe. So with Europe the marriage exchanges were quite liberal. Europe remembers Anna, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, very well, because she married a French king, and her son was named Philip I of France, and he was a king. And in fact, Franks monarchy did not have Greek names at the time, so there were no Philips in France. And she, being an Orthodox Christian, coming and calling her son Philip, brought a new name. And now we don't see Philip as something extraordinary as a French name. They had many Philips in the succession line, but she was the first Greek name in France. Vladimir had many wives, the baptizer, and one of his wives was a queen of daughter of the Norwegian king. Vladimir Monomach was a son of Byzantium prince of Byzantine Empire, and his wife was Githa of Wessex, the daughter of the last English Anglo-Saxon king, who was defeated in the Battle of Gastings and killed, and his relatives emigrated, ran away to Scandinavia, and later married a Russian duke. Did I forget to say anything about this? We even have a weird account of a Russian princess divorcing an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on the account of being a pervert, or like conducting satanic rituals. And it was there was a very kind of disturbing story, which was well known all over Europe at the time. Not just divorcing a king, but running away on the account of him being a Satanist. In fact, as I said, Rurikids, they were all married, because the earlier you breed, the earlier you make a son, the more chances that you will inherit something. But in fact, in the legends, we see that they had a lot of divorces, and these divorces were always considered as something terrible and extraordinary, at the same time being completely frequent. So they're very frequent. Kind of weird, right? If something happens every year, all the time, and every time you consider it something extraordinary and unheard of before. Russian Christianity was a bit now I'll try to tell you some more stories so that you could imagine how the life in the ancient Russia looks like. So here you can see coins. We do have coins found in Russian archaeology, and the weird thing, we have coins in the ancient Rus, but we don't have coins for the Mongolian rule Russia. Weird, but I didn't really heard much about people actually abandoning. The introduction of currency is usually considered a huge advancement, right? Seldom we hear of the story of abandoning currency and then adopting it again. And in fact, this did happen in Russia. And on the coins, actually, we see the first Cyrillic inscriptions. So the only few inscriptions before the introduction of Cyrillic in Russia are in Norse runes. and they are written in Swedish, like Varangian Swedish. But after Russia is baptized, converted to Christianity, we see Cyrillic writings in the either Old Church Slavonic language, which is essentially Old Bulgarian. Yeah, I have to say that all the literary people in the Kievan Rus, they were bilingual. But they didn't really speak, English or French. I mean, what was at that time English or French. The most popular languages were, of course, Greek, Latin, Old Church Slavonic, which is Old Bulgarian. Why? Because Bible was written in Old Church Slavonic. And the Old Russian language did not really have a written form. So if you managed to learn to write, and it was actually quite widespread, you would have to know Old Church Slavonic to write, and Old Russian Slavic to speak to people around you. When talking about the literary artifacts, of course, Bible and the Chronicles are the main literary works you can take in the library. But we actually do have other things. We have a traveling novel, an account of called The Journey Over Three Seas, about a guy who travels from Kiev to India, into China. And his trip took him 3 years, and he actually wrote down his account on the journey. And it's written in a weird language, because this guy obviously was not a scholar, and he didn't really speak Old Church, or write Old Church Slavonic well. So the language he's writing his book is partly Old Church Slavonic, partly Old Russian. And this is actually an important pillar of how we study ancient Russian literature. It's interesting reading by itself, so it's worth taking in the library or finding on the internet. Another thing, we do find some inscriptions on the walls. An interesting thing, again, I said about Christianity brought Cyrillic script to Russia. But in fact, there were even two scripts brought to Russia, Cyrillic and Glagolic. Although Glagolic is more fit for the Southern Slavic languages like Serbian, Croatian, or what was Southern Slavic at that time. But it was used in Russia as well, and we see some Old Russian writings on the walls of cathedrals. You can Google for them and find them. You actually visit them personally in Kiev, say. 5 minutes. Okay. The last few things I wanted to speak about, the birch writings of the Novgorod were discovered only in the 20th century, and this is a very interesting piece of culture you can actually see with your own eyes. Important because it doesn't say about wars and politics. It's an account of everyday life, and official writing in Russia happened on the kind of pergamon made of animal skin. Not a very expensive thing. But these birch writings are made on wood, and since wood is very fragile, but at the same time much cheaper, you can the inscriptions there are about the ordinary life. So if you're interested in ordinary life, again, you can find them on the internet. There were huge amounts of them. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to tell you about the old Russia, which eventually led into the emergence of Russian Empire, Ukraine, Poland, various other nations. Have I forgotten anything?